You're listening to Savory. It's about the people and processes behind food production and the politics that shape our understanding of the food system. I'm your host, Marika Dunham. This episode is about the commodification of food and the profound effects that has on our food system. In navigating the nourishment of our bodies, we structure our lives around food. At an individual level, this can involve carving out time in the day for eating, cooking, grocery shopping, and meal planning. Scaling these individual practices up to larger groups of people, we can see how food cultures are created and sustained. For example, think about how a university student living on campus might navigate nourishing their body, having limited time, money, and potentially limited kitchen space, in contrast to the ways that a high-income tech employee in the Seattle area might navigate nourishment, having access to and money for online food delivery programs from Whole Foods or Amazon. When we compare the two, we can begin to see how a person's relationship to food is specific to their current geographic location, their social and cultural preferences, and the money that they have for food. While we as individuals incorporate food into our daily lives in accordance with our socioeconomic realities and cultural preferences, governments shape their policy, budgets, and practices to ensure that citizens are receiving adequate nutrition. As food historians Bentley and Hobart state, civilizations rise and fall based on their ability to keep their citizens fed. And keeping populations nourished is no simple task. Historically, there have been many different methods and systems that civilizations have used for food production and distribution. Within the current North American food system, governments utilize a market-based approach for food distribution. This means that food is produced for and distributed on the market. Food policy ensures that citizens get access to food through market participation. This means that food is a commodity. It's not a guaranteed right, and an individual's access to food is contingent upon their ability to pay for that food. So it's contingent upon their access to money, whether that's from their income or their wealth. So in the end, to accomplish the seemingly straightforward task of eating, we, as consumers, exist within this really dynamic relationship between the market and the government, or the nation-state. This dynamic relationship is implicit in the structure of our food system, but it may not be obvious to the average consumer. For example, the USDA sets guidelines and regulations to minimize the risk of foodborne illness by ensuring produce is traceable to the farm that it was harvested from, and by ensuring that food safety practices are followed through all the steps of harvesting and processing. This regulation, called GAP certification, shapes how food is grown and harvested and what foods can be sold within certain institutions like schools or supermarkets. But it may not be common knowledge to the average consumer that this program exists. Another example of an implicit reality of our food system is our collective understanding and acceptance that food is a commodity. The commodification of food has profound effects on every aspect of the food system, from production to processing, distribution, retail, and consumption. Food, when it is commodified, is not simply a basic human need. It becomes an opportunity for profit. When we commodify food, profitability becomes the driver of progress. In the 20th century, the goal of the North American food system was to produce as many calories as possible as cheaply as possible. For the food system to become profitable, it needed to become efficient, which means minimizing inputs and maximizing yields. Through consolidation and scientific and technological advancement, we have transformed food production into a modern industrial system. But this cheap food production is largely unattached to the environmental impacts and social repercussions of this system. Our modern North American food system is a highly complex web of people, businesses, governments, and institutions operating at numerous scales. So we have local, regional, and global food systems, and numerous geographic regions. What's growing in Florida is not the same thing that's growing in Alberta. We can think of the food system as all of the processes in place getting food from the ground to the people. This includes the production, processing, distribution, retail, and consumption of food. In order to understand how we got to where we are today, I am going to offer a very brief history into the modern North American food system. Putting the food system into a historical context allows us to distance ourselves from the everyday and begins to put into perspective how our current food system operates within a specific political, cultural, and economic moment in time. Before I dive into this history, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that, first, this is a very brief history, and there is certainly a lot more to this story than I can tell you in a single podcast episode. And second, the history I am telling you is informed by Western schools of thought. This narrative of modernization is rooted in academic theory, as well as some American and Canadian government statistics. This is simply one way of knowing and understanding our food system. All right, here's the tea. In the last 100 years or so, the North American food system has undergone substantial changes as the processes of modernization have unfolded. During the 20th century, scientific advancement, technological advancement, and industrialization and agricultural practices provided cost-efficient methods to increase yields, maximize profits, and provide consumers with affordable, safe, and reliable products. In the early 1900s, farms were small and diversified, which means they were growing multiple commodities or crops, approximately 5 on average per farm. And approximately 41% of the North American population was directly employed in agriculture. After World War II, North America experienced rapid industrialization and advancement in scientific knowledge. Integration of scientific knowledge, such as the use of synthetic, chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and herbicides, greatly increased yields. During this time period, the total number of farms decreased while the size of each farm increased. As farms consolidated their land, there was less diversity of production on each farm, allowing farms to specialize their efforts by focusing on producing only one commodity. During this time period, mechanization on farms greatly reduced the amount of human labor needed on each farm. And in 2018, 1.3% of the American population was directly employed in agriculture. Utilizing science and technology to improve farming practices greatly increased yields. For example, the U.S. dairy industry increased milk production from 117 billion pounds of milk in 1944 to 190 billion pounds of milk in 2008, while decreasing the number of dairy cows from 25.5 million to 9.3 million during that same period of time. This means farms are producing more milk with less than half the amount of dairy cows. They did this through selectively breeding cows that were high milk producers with bulls that had genetics for high milk production, which resulted in an increase of the average production per Holstein cow from 2 gallons of milk a day in 1944 to 7.5 gallons a day in 2008. Having less cows that produce more milk is better for the operation costs of the farm, as well as the environmental footprint of milk, because farmers need less feed for their animals, making milk production a more efficient process. Using technology to advance the genetics of an animal, and as a result, the efficiency of an entire industry, is one example of how the food system has developed over the last 100 years. Consolidated and specialized farming, which we often call monoculture farming, proved to be a more efficient type of farming, and, given the pressures and volatility of the agricultural market, only those turning a profit, and thus farming efficiently, can persist. This type of heavily scientifically and technologically integrated farming is what today is referred to as the conventional food system. While this staggering drop in the percentage of population that's directly employed in agriculture marks a very clear shift towards removing the bulk of North Americans from the realities of food production, There are many ways to interpret this information. I read a USDA study that alluded to this narrative that industrialization has liberated people from the many laborious hours of food production and allowed them to pursue other professions, thus bolstering the national economy. There are also some people, like Michael Pollan, who romanticize the days of small-scale family farms. And this romanticism of homesteading conceals the grim reality that agricultural labor laws in the United States have always been exploitative. The history of racial and social oppression linked to agricultural economies in the U.S. is undeniable. Colonization relied on slave labor for commodity production. The land upon which the food system exists in North America is the traditional and ancestral land of indigenous people. It is important to acknowledge that the food system I address here, both historical and modern, is a Western food system, and as a result, the approach to the land, the economic ideology influencing agricultural practices, and the stories we are told, who writes food system history and who gets highlighted in that history, are not universal. Like I said before, this is a very brief introduction into food history, and there's a lot more to the story. I encourage you to look into it. But for the sake of this story, the big takeaway here from that last little section is that right now, farming is a business. And for farms to stay in business, they have to turn a profit, which can be difficult given the natural volatility and low profit margins of agricultural markets. Even though farming can be a risky business, governments know that having a well-fed population is essential, so they create policy, like subsidies and tariffs, to help protect their domestic farmers from the volatility of the market. Naturally, farmers have a vested interest in the creation of agricultural policy. Producers of certain commodities pay for industry representatives to lobby for policy that is beneficial for their commodity, like the dairy industry, eggs, or beef. As consumers, our primary point of contact in the food system is the point of purchase. Whether we are buying food at a supermarket or a farmer's market or through online grocery delivery, the commodification of food informs retail practices in many fascinating ways. Buying food for the average consumer looks a lot different today than it did 100 years ago. I want you to take a second and join me on a visual metaphor. I want you to imagine waking up in a random Walmart supercenter tomorrow. It's a bit of a nightmare, I know. But firstly, based on the food products in that Walmart, do you think you could figure out what town you're in? And second, I want you to think about what a grocery store in that random town might have looked like 100 years ago. Back in those ye old days of the early 1900s, people shopped at small corner stores, which sourced their food locally and regionally, purchasing in bulk quantities that varied in volatility, because there was no refrigeration, so contamination and bacteria growth often compromised the quality and freshness of products, and affordability, as seasonal availability controlled non-fixed prices. These Cracker and Barrel pickle stores gave way to markets stacked with individually packaged products. Industrial inventions such as refrigeration and freezing, in combination with new packaging technologies like cardboard with waxed paper and tin cans, allowed for large food manufacturing corporations to become household names as products were mass-produced, branded, shipped, and advertised on a national scale. Food historians Bentley and Hobart say the advent of the industrial system gave consumers the promise of purity, consistency, and a low cost they could rely on. Industrial processing increased the shelf life of products, and improved transportation increased the available geographic market for those products, which led to a new kind of grocery store, the supermarket. The supermarket was created as an embodiment of capitalist, cultural, and political ideals during the Cold War. Supermarkets' economies of scale increased the selection of products and their convenience while lowering prices. Because supermarkets are not bound to a regional market, they become a showcase for national brands and products. Consumers are able to purchase food with consistent quality and availability regardless of season. Today, supermarket chains are standardized so that each retail location within a given chain has the same look, layout, and selection. In this way, the supermarket is really distanced from its physical geographic location. So a Safeway is a Safeway is a Safeway, and it doesn't matter what town you're in, that Safeway is going to have the same feeling and experience. So within the produce section of the supermarket, food is sourced nationally and globally, which means there's a very stable selection all year round. And the produce that's available is a really simplified amount of varieties than is naturally occurring, so we only see a few types of carrots or apples when there's actually hundreds of species of that type of produce. And our food tends to be really uniform, so all the carrots look the same, they have the same color and no impurities. It's also very safe, and it's very predictable in processing, taste, and appearance. And this lack of seasonality that the supermarket has is another way that the supermarket's really distanced from and removed from its physical geographic location. And it's also a way that the realities of food production are concealed by the produce section in the supermarket. So this creates a gap between consumers and the realities of food production, but it also creates a gap between consumers and food producers. What we see at the store does not necessarily tell us how something was grown or where it came from. And food labels like GMO-free, organic, fair trade, they work to inform us as consumers about the realities of food production, but they also highlight the connection between the personal and the political. At the same time that we, as consumers, are removed from the realities of food production, we know that our food choices are important. Because we know that diet is a central determinant of health. We know our dietary choices and resulting agricultural practices have environmental impacts. We know that our food system has social impacts, and it currently utilizes a low-waged, primarily migrant labor force. So the goal of the conventional food system, to produce as many calories as possible, as cheaply as possible, it results in a very unbalanced system. And there's a lot of people, like Michael Pollan, Julie Guthman, Marianne Nussel, just to name a few, who are really critical of this system. And this system was put in place to address the needs of food security in the 20th century, which was trying to get cheap food to people. And while this system was really successful at creating a system that allows for really cheap food production, there's a difference between producing cheap food and ensuring that people earn enough money to access food. Food insecurity is not a matter of not having enough food to go around. It's a matter of not having the resources distributed to ensure that every person has access to the basic necessities for life. That has not been addressed by the conventional food system. And another thing to consider, within the conventional food system, the long-term environmental impacts of this type of production is not incorporated to the cost of food, and farms currently utilize cheap labor to keep production costs low. These discontents with the industrial food system have inspired people to advocate for alternative farming practices, like organic farming. And alternative food networks, they demand changes in agricultural practices to be more socially and/or environmentally sustainable, and they often advocate for supporting local food production and supporting farms who utilize ecological farming practices, whether it's organic, no-till, or permaculture. They also advocate for third-party verifications to ensure that farming practices are ecological or ethical, so fair trade, organic, non-GMO. And there's a lot of alternative farming movements and practices. They're not always cohesive in purpose or outcome, but generally they have a mission to make the food system more socially equitable or environmentally sustainable. Alternative farming practices and alternative food networks, though not always a cohesive movement, their approaches are often only addressing the practices of the food system rather than the systemic causes of those practices. So a practice of the food system is monoculture farming. The cause of that practice is a capitalist system that puts pressure on the farm to have to maximize profits each year in order to stay in business. And alternative farming movements, they often utilize a market-based strategy like buy organic or buy local, which limits participation to individuals that have additional flexible income to spend on food, because these alternatives tend to be more expensive than the conventional system, because the conventional system is really good at producing very cheap and affordable food. I think it's really important when we have a conversation about what a sustainable food system looks like to think critically about how alternatives to the food system are incorporated within the same capitalist modes of production as the conventional system. Alternative food networks provide a different form of capitalism, not an alternative to the capitalist system, which is fine. And there's nothing wrong with supporting organic, local, diversified farming. In fact, there's a lot of benefits to it for the local economy and for the farmers that you're supporting. But there's also nothing wrong with incorporating the conventional food system into our discussion about sustainability. In fact, I think it's really important when we're having conversations about a sustainable food system to think about how we can change the practices of the conventional system to be more sustainable, along with supporting alternative food system networks to meet the needs and demands of consumers. So the purpose of this episode was to frame a discussion about the commodification of food and the historical context that our food system fits within. When we commodify food, profitability, unattached to the environmental or social repercussions, becomes the driver of progress. The conventional system removes consumers from the realities of food production, creating a gap between food producers and consumers. Alternative food networks have risen in response to these discontents with the conventional system, in particular to address the gap between producers and consumers. However, participation in alternatives is limited, as alternative food production tends to be more labor-intensive and expensive. Although we, as consumers, are removed from the realities of food production, we also know that the very personal choices of what we buy at the supermarket are also quite political. Food labels like GMO-free, organic, fair trade, vegan, low-fat, just to name a few, are the tip of the iceberg for understanding how our food purchases affect our own health, our environment, and the health of those around us. As a result, the political and economic effects of commodified food profoundly shape food culture. The types of foods we eat, if we buy organic or identify as vegan, can be a large part of our identities. We shape our food preferences around social and cultural identity, and around our budgets. In the next episode of Savory, I unpack food culture further by questioning where our obsession with healthy foods comes from, and how constantly thinking about the impact of our diets on our bodily health is a dominant cultural way of knowing food. This episode of Savory was written, produced, recorded, and edited at Quest University on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I am deeply humbled and grateful to have had the opportunity to live, work, learn, and grow on this land. Thank you for listening and supporting this project. I hope that it inspires you to think critically about our food system and listen openly to the perspectives of others. Creating a podcast is a highly collaborative endeavor. This episode of Savory was written, produced, recorded, and edited by myself, Marika Dunham, under the guidance of the incredible Dr. Emma Davy. My script supervisor was Min Park. Original music was created by Cameron Lee. You can find his work at eelromance.com. And graphic design is by Jessica Matyas. You can follow her on Instagram at Matyas Creates.